She was Hollywood royalty before she became an actual princess. But behind the glamour, Grace Kelly's life was anything but a fairy tale. How did a woman adored on screen end up feeling trapped behind palace walls? From secret heartbreaks to silent rebellions, here's the story the crown couldn't hide. Grace's childhood, privilege without belonging. Grace Patricia Kelly was born in November 1929 in Philadelphia. Her childhood looked perfect from the outside. Her family was rich, respected, and well-connected. Her father, Jack Kelly, had won 3 Olympic gold medals and built a successful construction business. Her mother, Margaret, was a tough and admired physical education coach. Together, they raised 4 children in a house full of discipline, pride, and expectations. In that house, strength mattered more than anything. Athletic success was praised, and everyone was expected to perform at the highest level. Grace, the 3rd child, didn't fit the image. She was quiet, often sick, and not interested in sports. Her siblings ran, swam, competed, and earned trophies. Grace read books, stayed in bed with fevers, and listened more than she spoke. She wasn't the daughter her father had hoped for, and she felt it. Jack made his disappointment clear. He gave attention to the children who reminded him of himself, strong, outgoing, and goal-driven. Grace wasn't loud or tough. She was polite, shy, and more interested in stories than sports. Her father called her the cold one and showed more pride in her sisters and brother. Her mother was more patient but still valued discipline and success. She turned inward. Books became her way out. She read everything she could, from novels to plays. When things felt too overwhelming, she disappeared into the lives of the characters she imagined. In those stories, she could be brave, powerful, and admired. She started memorizing dialogue, creating scenes in her head, and acting them out in private. Her interest in acting began early, but it wasn't encouraged. Her parents thought it was a joke. Her father, in particular, saw the theater as low class. He made comments that stung and refused to support her dreams. Acting didn't match the image he wanted for his family. But Grace didn't back down. She kept reading plays, writing in her journal, and picturing herself on stage. She knew this wasn't just a phase. Religion added another layer. The Kellys were devout Catholics, and Grace followed the rules, but she didn't feel connected to the structure. Church was about formality and duty. She followed along, but quietly dreamed of something beyond it. Marriage and motherhood in Philadelphia didn't appeal to her. She wanted something different, more creative, more personal, more free. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she felt the pull. Over time, the distance between her and her family grew. They didn't argue. They just didn't understand each other. Grace learned to keep her thoughts to herself. She mastered the ability to look calm, even when she felt overwhelmed. She became good at holding back, which would later become part of her on-screen image. Her world was full of pressure to perform, to impress, to fit a mold she never agreed to. But in quiet ways, she resisted. She wrote poems in the margins of her textbooks. She stared out the windows during family gatherings, thinking about cities she'd never seen. She knew she wasn't built for the life she was expected to live. She didn't feel rebellious. She just knew there had to be more. Acting gave her a sense of direction, so, quietly, she started to plan how to get there. From wallflower to leading lady. After high school, she made a choice that her family didn't expect. She moved to New York and enrolled in the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. It wasn't just a change in scenery, it was a clean break. In that busy city, surrounded by strangers and stage lights, she finally had the freedom to become someone new. At the Academy, Grace threw herself into the work. Acting wasn't about being loud or dramatic for her. It was about control. She understood that small gestures, quiet emotion, and stillness could be more powerful than shouting. One of the first things she focused on was her voice. She trained it carefully, spending hours practicing elocution, refining her pronunciation, and softening the nasal tones from her Philadelphia upbringing. Her goal wasn't to sound British, but to sound polished. Her final voice had a calm, precise rhythm, elegant without being cold. It became one of her trademarks. Alongside her classes, Grace worked as a model. She wasn't the typical bombshell model of the time, but she had something different. Her camera presence was cool and composed. She could hold a pose without trying to be the center of attention, and somehow that made her unforgettable. Ads and catalog shoots gave her experience in front of the lens. More importantly, they helped her understand how to control her image. This awareness became one of her greatest strengths. She studied how stars carried themselves and learned what worked on screen. When she got her first acting roles, she brought that same precision with her. Every look, every movement, every pause, it was all thought out. She didn't need to dominate the frame. She knew how to hold it. At first, casting agents didn't know what to make of her. She didn't fit neatly into any mold. She wasn't flashy, and she wasn't provocative. But she had something that stood out. Her natural elegance, paired with a calm intensity, caught the attention of people who mattered. Her early roles didn't make huge headlines, but they made people look twice. Directors started noticing how she handled complex scenes. She didn't overact. She played characters with a kind of inner strength that felt real. In a time when many actresses were coached to play loud or exaggerated, Grace brought stillness. It gave her performances a sense of honesty. She could play wealthy socialites, vulnerable wives, or curious adventurers, and she never felt out of place. Grace didn't rely on charm or flirtation to win over directors. She relied on discipline. She came to sets prepared, knew her lines, and respected the crew. That made her reliable, and in an industry full of egos, reliability stood out. Directors like John Ford and Alfred Hitchcock were drawn to her. They saw that she could carry a scene without showing off. Her breakout came faster than anyone expected. Once she started landing major film roles, audiences responded immediately. Viewers were drawn to her quiet confidence. They believed her, whether she was solving a mystery or navigating a romantic subplot. She had a presence that made people lean in, not pull back. But while Grace's on-screen persona was composed and controlled, her real life was far more daring. Away from the cameras, she was quietly rewriting the rules for herself, making choices that didn't fit the image Hollywood tried to project. A private life full of risks. The Barbizon Hotel for Women was supposed to keep girls like Grace out of trouble. Strict curfews, no male visitors, and a long list of rules promised parents that their daughters would be safe and supervised. But Grace didn't go to New York to be supervised. She danced barefoot in the hotel hallways, laughing with friends late into the night. The other girls there remembered her as elegant but fun, always more curious than cautious. She wore cashmere sweaters, simple pearls, and glasses, but she was far from shy when it came to doing what she wanted. Her public image might have been quiet and reserved, but in private, Grace moved with calm confidence. She didn't draw attention to herself, but she also didn't ask for permission. At school, Grace started a relationship with one of her instructors, Don Richardson. He was her acting coach, and he saw in her what few others had seen at that point: real, serious talent. She didn't treat the romance like a scandal or a rebellion. To her, it was simply a part of life. She felt something, and she followed that feeling. When her parents found out about the relationship, they were horrified. They had already dismissed acting as a career, calling it low-class and unstable. Now their daughter was romantically involved with her teacher? That was too much. They confronted her about it, made it clear they disapproved, but she didn't back down. She wasn't loud about it, but she didn't end the relationship just because they wanted her to. That quiet refusal to give in would become one of the defining traits of her early years. Grace rarely argued or raised her voice. Instead, she just kept moving in the direction she had chosen, even if no one else understood it. What made Grace different from many of her peers was how carefully she controlled the public version of herself. While other young actresses got caught up in parties or headlines, Grace was strategic. She understood the power of a clean image, especially for someone new in the business. She was aware that people were watching, judging, and waiting to define her. So she gave them only what she wanted them to see. She wore tailored dresses, kept her makeup minimal, and kept her answers to reporters short and polite. In her personal life, she followed her own rhythm. She read poetry. She experimented with movement, speech, and character. She took risks, not for attention, but for growth. The same girl who once struggled to find her voice in a room full of loud personalities was now learning how to use that voice on stage. She was learning how to carry herself in a way that pulled focus. Her professors saw it. Her classmates saw it. Slowly, the world would see it too. There was a confidence developing in her that didn't come from being loud or bold in a traditional way. It came from deciding what she wanted and then quietly going after it. The relationship with Don Richardson didn't last forever, but it marked a shift in how Grace navigated the world. She stopped trying to meet her family's expectations and focused instead on building something of her own. That period in New York set the foundation for everything that came next. It was where Grace learned that the rules weren't fixed. They were suggestions, often made by people who didn't know her. She learned how to bend them without breaking them. She didn't try to shock anyone, and she didn't pretend to be perfect. She just stayed focused, stayed aware, and kept moving forward. When Grace eventually left New York for Hollywood, she carried that quiet self-assurance with her. She arrived in Los Angeles with a refined accent, a polished appearance, and a clear sense of what she would and wouldn't do. But for all her clarity and control in her career, Grace's personal life proved far more complicated. A pattern of difficult relationships. While the press showed her as Hollywood's poised sweetheart, behind the scenes, her relationships were complicated, hidden, and full of emotional weight. She didn't fall for her co-stars because it helped her image. She fell for them because that's where she felt understood, at least for a moment. Gary Cooper was the first major heartbreak. They met while filming High Noon, and Grace, still in her early 20s, was drawn to his confidence and quiet authority. Cooper was married, more than 20 years older, and unavailable in every way that mattered. But that didn't stop Grace. The connection was intense, and even though they tried to keep things quiet, it wasn't hard for the set crew to figure out what was going on. When filming ended, so did the relationship. Cooper moved on. Grace didn't say much about it publicly, but those close to her noticed the silence that followed. Then came Clark Gable. Grace met him during the filming of Mogambo, and again the pattern repeated. Gable was older, experienced, and charismatic. Grace was hopeful that this would be different, but Gable wasn't looking for anything beyond the set. Grace believed their chemistry would carry on after the film wrapped, but Gable didn't feel the same. She had fallen hard, thinking this time might be real. Instead, she was left with disappointment and confusion. Her mother flew to the film location to supervise, worried about her daughter's growing reputation. It didn't change much. Grace made her own choices, and Gable was one of them. The headlines painted her as a heartbreaker, but inside, she was often the one getting hurt. These weren't just affairs for publicity. They were attempts to find something stable in an industry where everything felt temporary. Grace often chose men who were emotionally distant or already committed elsewhere. It wasn't a mistake she made once. It became a cycle. One of the few relationships that looked like it could last was with fashion designer Oleg Cassini. He was charming, well-connected, and fully in love with her. They started seeing each other seriously, and for a while, it seemed like Grace had finally found someone she could build a life with. They talked about marriage. They made plans. Grace even introduced him to her family, hoping for approval, but the Kellys weren't impressed. Cassini was divorced, had children from a previous marriage, and came from a Russian-Italian background that didn't match the traditional Catholic image her family wanted for her. They dismissed him quickly. The pressure from her parents was constant. Grace was expected to keep up appearances, not just as an actress, but as the daughter of a prominent East Coast family. A designer with a colorful past didn't fit that vision. Grace tried to push back, but the disapproval wore her down. Eventually, she broke things off with Cassini. It wasn't because she stopped loving him. It was because she didn't know how to stand between the life she wanted and the one she was told to live. The breakup with Cassini left deeper scars than her flings with married co-stars. It wasn't just another love lost. It was a moment where she gave in to outside pressure and let go of something she truly cared about. And then came something even more difficult. During her relationship with Cassini, Grace became pregnant. She was terrified. The news threatened everything: her image, her career, her family's name. With no support from the people closest to her, she made the decision to end the pregnancy. This experience marked a turning point. It was more than heartbreak. It was loss, shame, and isolation all at once. The weight of it followed her. Those who knew her noticed a shift. She became more guarded, less hopeful in love, more careful with her choices. The public still saw the same glowing Grace on magazine covers, but she had started to pull away from the dream she once believed in. And just as she began to retreat from the fantasy of lasting love, an unexpected script appeared. One not written by Hollywood, but by fate. The royal proposal. Grace Kelly didn't expect a royal title when she showed up at the Cannes Film Festival in 1955. She was there as part of a promotional tour representing Hollywood glamour in a European setting. That year, she had already cemented her status as one of the biggest stars in the world. What she didn't know was that she was about to meet the man who would change the course of her life forever. Prince Rainier III of Monaco was also attending the festival. At the time, Monaco was more of a quiet coastal state than a tourist magnet. Rainier, who had ruled since 1949, was looking for ways to bring attention and prestige to his tiny principality. A meeting between Grace and Rainier was arranged as part of a photo shoot at the prince's palace. The idea came from Paris Match magazine, but behind the scenes, it served multiple interests. The studio wanted publicity. Rainier wanted visibility. Grace went along with it, unaware it would lead to a marriage proposal within a year. Their first meeting was short, but left an impression. Rainier gave her a tour of the palace, showed her his private zoo, and posed for photos beside her. Reports from that day described the prince as polite but reserved, and Grace as charming yet composed. There wasn't a thunderbolt moment or grand romantic gesture, but something clicked. After she returned to the U.S., the two quietly kept in touch. The letters started coming soon after their meeting. At first, they were friendly, polite, and formal. Grace's parents were kept in the loop, but they didn't think much of it. People wrote letters all the time, especially in long-distance friendships. Over time, though, the tone shifted. The notes became warmer. Rainier began to show a personal side that few had seen. Grace, who had just come off a string of difficult relationships, was intrigued by the balance of authority and gentleness in his writing. The relationship deepened during these months of long-distance courtship. In public, Grace continued filming, doing press, and attending events. Privately, she was building a bond with someone who came from a completely different world. For someone raised in a loud, competitive family and molded by the chaos of Hollywood, Rainier's steadiness had an unexpected appeal. By Christmas 1955, Rainier decided it was time to make things official. He flew to Philadelphia to visit Grace and her family. This was no casual drop-by. He stayed at their home and joined in their holiday traditions. The visit was a test. Grace's parents, especially her father, were skeptical. They had always imagined Grace marrying a wealthy American businessman, not a foreign prince with a small domain and a modest bank account. But Rainier held his ground. He was polite, respectful, and careful with his words. More importantly, he took the time to get to know her family. After just 3 days in Philadelphia, Rainier asked Grace to marry him. He didn't stage a dramatic proposal or involve a camera crew. It happened quietly in the middle of a family gathering. Grace said yes. The engagement was announced publicly in January 1956, and it immediately took over the headlines on both sides of the Atlantic. Hollywood's most glamorous actress was about to become royalty. From that moment on, everything changed. Grace had always worked under pressure, but this was different. She had to start preparing for a life she had no blueprint for. Her wedding became an international event. She received thousands of letters from fans, well-wishers, and even European nobility. Reporters flooded her doorstep. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the soon-to-be princess. But before she stepped away from the screen, she had one last role to finish. High Society would be her final film. Released just months before her wedding, it starred Grace as a socialite caught between two suitors, played by Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. On set, she wore the actual 10.47-carat engagement ring Rainier had given her. In some scenes, it's clearly visible. There was no attempt to hide it. In fact, it added to the character's charm. The movie became a subtle farewell to her film career, though most people watching at the time didn't know it would be her last. The wedding was scheduled for April 1956. It was planned in two parts, a civil ceremony followed by a grand religious one. Grace left for Monaco by ship, carrying nearly 80 pieces of luggage, including her wardrobe, jewelry, and wedding dress materials. MGM sent a film crew to document the journey, turning her departure into a studio-backed media event. On screen, Grace had played elegant heiresses and glamorous wives. Off-screen, she was now preparing to take on a role she couldn't rehearse. Her marriage to Prince Rainier marked the official end of her life as an actress. She had agreed to leave Hollywood behind, not because she was forced, but because she chose to step into something entirely new. A palace with rules. Almost immediately after the engagement was announced, conversations shifted from film roles and scripts to royal titles, official duties, and public appearances. Her career, which had taken years of training and personal struggle to build, ended in a matter of weeks. Once she became Princess Grace of Monaco, one of Rainier's first decisions was to ban all of her films from being shown in the country. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was an actual restriction placed on her body of work. The films that had defined her, earned her awards, and given her an identity separate from her family and future husband. They disappeared from view in the very place she now had to call home. Grace had spent years shaping her public image, honing her craft, and finding confidence on film sets. On screen, she had control. She could decide how to play a character, how to express emotion, and how to command a scene. But now the roles were assigned, the expectations fixed. She was no longer the star of her own story. She became a symbol, expected to follow protocol and serve a new purpose, to represent Monaco quietly and perfectly. Her daily life changed overnight. She had to learn the protocols of royal life, how to speak at diplomatic events, how to dress for formal occasions, and how to carry herself as a princess in every moment. These weren't optional tasks. They were obligations, scheduled and rehearsed down to the smallest details. Hollywood had been demanding, but it gave her moments of joy. She had loved working, loved creating, loved slipping into character and building something from a script. Now, that part of her life was not just paused, it was erased. Grace's name still lived on in old movie posters and film reels abroad, but in Monaco, she was no longer an actress. She was simply Her Serene Highness. The silence around her past created a deeper problem. She was surrounded by people who didn't know that part of her or chose not to acknowledge it. Grace couldn't talk about her favorite directors, her early stage days, or the little details of her former life without sensing discomfort from those around her. The longer she stayed, the more distant that past felt. Her identity, once rooted in creative expression, was now reduced to official duties and polished appearances. Behind closed doors, the stress began to wear her down. The attention didn't stop at public events. Photographers lingered outside the palace. The international press followed her every move. In Hollywood, fame came with a certain freedom. You could take a break, disappear between roles, or shape your narrative. In Monaco, the spotlight stayed on, and it wasn't hers to control. Her friendships from her acting days slowly faded. Phone calls grew less frequent. Visits from old colleagues became rare. Some assumed she was too busy, others sensed she had changed. In truth, the space around her had changed. She was no longer Grace Kelly. This distance didn't just exist between her and the outside world. It grew inside her as well. The creative spark that once pushed her through rehearsals and helped her reinvent herself started to fade. She wasn't using her voice the same way. She wasn't building characters, memorizing lines, or hearing applause. She missed that rhythm, that quiet fulfillment of doing something that mattered to her. By the time she had fully settled into royal life, the person she used to be had grown quiet, not gone, but distant. Her performances now took place at state functions instead of film sets, with scripted speeches instead of improvised scenes. The curtain hadn't fallen, it had simply been replaced by a wall of silence. Yet, even behind palace walls, the performer in her never fully disappeared. Grace After Dark. By day, Grace Kelly was a royal figure wrapped in silk, diamonds, and duty. But at night, when the last guest left the palace ballroom and the cameras were finally turned off, Grace would slip into something simple. She'd quietly change out of her gowns and into plain clothes, avoiding anything that might draw attention. Then, without an entourage or press in sight, she'd leave the palace behind. Her destination wasn't some secret society or elite event. It was the orphanages tucked away in Monaco, unseen by the public, unknown to the tourists, and certainly far from the glitz of the Monte Carlo casino lights. Grace didn't go for appearances. There were no photographers waiting, no press releases sent out. She did it quietly, sometimes unannounced. It wasn't part of a royal schedule. It was personal. She'd arrive with books under her arm and small gifts in hand. Sometimes it was toys, other times clothes or sweets. She didn't come with speeches or formality. She sat down on the floor, read to the children, and listened to them. She didn't act like royalty in those moments. She acted like someone who just wanted to be there, someone who needed those visits as much as the kids did. The stories she read were simple, sometimes silly. She'd make the children laugh with funny voices or give them advice that had nothing to do with princes or princesses. She stayed for hours, long past the time anyone expected her to leave. Staff would wait in the car, respecting the time she wanted to spend there. She didn't tell the press about these nights. In fact, she asked her staff not to talk about them at all. Many didn't even know. It was understood. These visits weren't for headlines or reputation. They were for her. Grace had been surrounded by people her entire life. From Hollywood producers to palace aides, someone was always telling her what to say, where to stand, how to smile. But in those orphanages, she wasn't being handled. She was choosing who to be. The quiet woman reading bedtime stories in a dim room full of laughing kids felt more like Grace Kelly than the woman standing at a royal podium in pearls. Some nights, she'd bring notebooks and draw with the children. Other nights, she'd simply sit with them while they talked about their day. She remembered their names. She came back when she said she would. That consistency mattered. For kids with no family structure, her return meant something. And for her, showing up without pressure, without expectation, was a small freedom. The palace staff learned to stay quiet about it. A driver would be ready, but instructions were minimal. A maid might leave the books out ahead of time or pack up the gifts she had collected. But no one asked questions. No one followed. These weren't official royal outings. This was all simple. It was human, and for her, that was enough. Motherhood and routine. But just 1 year into her marriage, in 1957, Grace gave birth to her first child, Princess Caroline. The following year, she welcomed her son, Prince Albert. These milestones grounded her and gave her a new sense of purpose. Grace took to motherhood with a quiet intensity. Despite the demands of royal life, she made it a point to stay closely involved in her children's early years. In a palace full of advisors, staff, and strict etiquette, she chose to handle much of the parenting herself. She didn't pass off every responsibility to nannies or let distance form between her and her kids. She sat with them during meal times, read to them in the evenings, and watched them take their first steps in the palace gardens. When official duties called her away, she made sure to return with the same calm presence her children had come to expect. Her public image shifted subtly during these years. The glamorous actress-turned-princess was now also seen as a devoted mother. Photographers often captured her walking hand in hand with her children outside the palace. There were shots of her attending school events, helping with costumes at recitals, and even pushing strollers through the royal grounds. These images showed a different side of Grace, a woman who found moments of peace in her daily routines with her family. Her goal was to raise them with a sense of responsibility, but without taking away their ability to be kids. There were meals at set times, bedtime routines, and quiet moments that didn't involve press or palace staff. The repetition of it all may have seemed ordinary from the outside, but for Grace, it gave her something to rely on. Every day had a beginning, middle, and end, and each day revolved around her children, not the crown. She also made space for joy in small moments. There were birthdays to plan, games to invent, and traditions to start. She was known to help decorate the palace for holidays, bake with the children, and dress up for themed parties in the garden. These weren't just ways to entertain the kids, they were a way for her to connect with something simple and genuine. It gave her a break from public life, where her every word and gesture was scrutinized. But Grace didn't use motherhood as a way to withdraw from royal duties completely. She still showed up to official events, greeted diplomats, and supported cultural programs in Monaco. But when the formal photos were done and the crowds cleared, she was back to being a hands-on parent. This balance didn't always come easily, but she maintained it with quiet discipline. Still, even the most carefully balanced lives can be shaken. As the years went on, Grace began facing losses that no public appearance or routine could steady. Private losses and a dimming spark. The loss of her father hit her harder than many realized. Grace had spent her life chasing his approval, even when his expectations felt cold and unreachable. He was never vocal about pride, and Grace had learned to work through that silence. But when he died in 1960, it left a space that no crown or title could fill. She had hoped that someday he might acknowledge what she had become, an international icon, a princess, a woman in control of her own life. Instead, she was left with memories of his distant nature and words she never got to hear. It was a quiet grief, the kind that follows you without announcing itself. At the same time, Grace was dealing with another kind of heartbreak, one that she kept private from the public eye. She experienced multiple miscarriages after becoming Princess of Monaco. Each loss was a personal blow. The palace, with its strict traditions and emphasis on producing heirs, only made the experience more isolating. Grace had once believed that motherhood might be the part of royal life that felt real, the part that grounded her. But these losses reminded her that even that role could be taken from her. She had no control over her body in those moments, and even less over how much of it she was expected to hide. These events chipped away at her energy. She stopped smiling as easily. Her staff noticed her quiet moments stretched longer than usual. She had once moved through the palace with curiosity and purpose. Now she moved with obligation. Her days were filled with ceremony, and her identity felt more like a role than a reality. There were moments when she tried to reach for something more. Grace spoke quietly to those close to her about returning to film. She never asked loudly. She didn't demand it, but the thought stayed with her. Acting had been her safe place, her escape, her form of expression. But every time she brought it up, the answer was the same. No. Her return to Hollywood would send the wrong message. Monaco had chosen her to be a symbol, not a performer. The palace couldn't risk blending royalty with celebrity, so she stayed silent and turned the idea over in her mind like something fragile and no longer hers. Even during charity galas or international visits, Grace seemed more distant than before. Her presence remained flawless. Her outfits perfectly styled, her posture never slipping, but her eyes often looked far away. Her spark hadn't disappeared, but it was dimmed, held back by rules and roles she couldn't shake off. In 1981, Grace met a young Princess Diana at a formal event in London. Diana was just 19 and newly engaged to Prince Charles. She looked overwhelmed, unsure of how to carry herself in a space filled with cameras and centuries of expectation. Grace pulled her aside for a private moment. The two women had very different stories, but Grace saw something familiar in the younger woman's nervous posture. She leaned in and told her something that Diana never forgot. "Don't worry, dear. It'll only get worse." The words were calm but cutting. They came from experience, not bitterness. Grace had lived that pressure, worn it like a second skin, and knew that the hardest part wasn't learning the rules, it was realizing how long you were expected to follow them. As the years passed, her isolation grew. The palace became quieter. Her relationship with Rainier grew distant. The spark that had drawn people to her in her early career had turned into something softer, still warm, still graceful, but missing the light it once had. The more time passed, the more her world closed in. Her children were growing up. The press focused more on their lives than hers. She was still admired, still watched, but rarely heard. And in these quiet years, Grace Kelly faded, not from memory or relevance, but from herself. The crash. On September 13, 1982, Grace Kelly got behind the wheel of her British Rover 3500. Sitting beside her was her youngest daughter, Princess Stephanie, who had just turned 17. They were driving from their country home, Rock Aigle, headed toward Monaco. The route was familiar but dangerous. The roads between Rock Aigle and the coast were narrow, steep, and full of tight curves. It was the same road Alfred Hitchcock had used to film To Catch a Thief. A place once linked to Grace's Hollywood charm now became the backdrop of her final hours. At some point during the drive, Grace suffered a stroke. The exact moment it happened isn't clear, but what followed was fast and devastating. She lost control of the car as it rounded one of the mountain's hairpin bends. The vehicle veered off the road, rolled down a steep slope of over 100 feet, and flipped before landing on its roof. Emergency services were called immediately. The car was crushed, and both Grace and Stephanie were trapped inside the wreckage. Paramedics arrived quickly and worked to free them. Grace was unconscious and badly hurt. She had suffered multiple fractures and serious internal injuries. Stephanie, although conscious, had also been injured and was in shock. Both were rushed to the Princess Grace Hospital Center in Monaco, the same hospital that had been renamed in Grace's honor only a few years earlier. Initial reports were unclear. News outlets around the world scrambled to confirm details. Some said both had survived with minor injuries. Others hinted that Grace's condition was critical. For hours there was silence from the palace. Inside the hospital, doctors fought to keep her alive. The stroke she suffered had caused irreversible damage. Combined with the injuries from the crash, her body couldn't recover. Grace Kelly died the next day, on September 14, 1982. She was 52 years old. Stephanie survived but faced a long physical and emotional recovery. She had been in the passenger seat when the car went off the cliff. For years, the trauma of the accident haunted her, especially because of false rumors that she had been driving. The royal family never confirmed or denied every detail, but it was later made public that Grace had indeed been behind the wheel when the stroke struck. The news of Grace's death stunned the world. It was hard to imagine that someone known for her poise and beauty, who had once lit up the screen and later become a real-life princess, could be gone so suddenly. The contrast between the glamorous image people held of her and the violent nature of the crash was jarring. Headlines ran across every major newspaper. TV networks interrupted programming with breaking news segments. People didn't just mourn a celebrity. They mourned a woman who had represented elegance, charm, and composure for over 2 decades. In Monaco, the mood was heavy. Shops closed, flags were lowered, streets that had once welcomed her with fanfare now fell silent. In Hollywood, old colleagues and friends expressed disbelief. Grace had left acting at the height of her career, but her image had never faded. Photos of her were still on magazine covers. She remained one of the most recognizable faces in the world. Her death wasn't just tragic, it felt unreal. As details about the crash became public, questions followed. People wondered why Grace was driving that day. Some asked why she hadn't used a chauffeur. Others speculated whether the stroke had been a warning sign of earlier health problems. A few reports noted that she had been under stress in the days leading up to the crash. None of these questions brought comfort. They only added to the heartbreak. The accident also took a toll on Stephanie. At 17, she had lost her mother in the most traumatic way possible. She had been there for every second of it. She rarely spoke about the accident in public, but years later, she admitted that the pain never fully left her. Being both a witness and a survivor made it harder to heal. The place where the crash happened is still talked about today. Locals in Monaco remember it as a dangerous stretch of road, especially during the rainy season. After Grace's accident, more guardrails were installed along those sharp curves, but nothing could erase what happened there. Tourists sometimes ask to see the site, but for the people of Monaco, it's more than a landmark. It's a place tied to deep personal loss. Grace's sudden death marked the end of an era. One day she was in the palace attending to her royal duties. The next, her car was being pulled from a ravine. There were no long goodbyes, no last public appearance, just a flash of breaking news that left people frozen. In a matter of seconds, everything changed. The name that still holds power. Grace Kelly's funeral was held at Monaco's St. Nicholas Cathedral and drew more than just mourning citizens. Heads of state, international royalty, Hollywood stars, and global dignitaries filled the pews. The chapel was lined with white flowers, and the streets outside overflowed with thousands of mourners. Every corner of the city felt the silence. Grace wasn't just Monaco's princess, she was the world's. One of the most emotional moments during the service came from someone who had known her long before the crown. Actor James Stewart, who starred alongside her in Rear Window, delivered the eulogy. His voice cracked as he spoke, not about her fame or her beauty, but her goodness. He said, "I just loved Grace Kelly, not because she was a princess, not because she was an actress, not because she was my friend, but because she was just about the nicest lady I ever met." That one line said more than any biography ever could. Stewart wasn't putting on a performance. He was grieving someone he genuinely admired. After her passing, Prince Rainier was never the same. He withdrew from public life for a while and rarely spoke about her in interviews. Those who worked in the palace during that time said his entire demeanor changed. There was a softness in him that hadn't been there before, but also a heaviness. He kept her photos on his desk and her memory close. He never remarried. In 2005, when he died, he was buried beside her in the family vault. Their graves sit side by side under the cathedral's stone floor, marked simply with their names and dates. But Grace Kelly didn't vanish with her death. Her name continued to carry weight in both the worlds she bridged, Hollywood and royalty. In Monaco, she became a symbol of modern heritage. Streets, parks, and hospitals were named in her honor. Her image appears on postage stamps, statues, and event banners. Tourists still walk the palace grounds hoping to catch a glimpse of the room she once called home. Film festivals and retrospectives regularly showcase her movies, drawing new audiences decades after her last performance. In the United States, museums feature exhibits that include her gowns, handwritten letters, and family photos. Her dresses are preserved as part of fashion history, and her style is still copied by designers. Celebrities continue to reference her in interviews, photo shoots, and red carpet appearances. Photographers still use her as a visual reference for timeless elegance. Even social media influencers tag her in posts about minimalist fashion and retro glamour. But Grace's impact wasn't just about visuals. Her charity work became a long-lasting part of her legacy. After moving to Monaco, she founded the Princess Grace Foundation, focused on supporting local artists, performers, and youth programs. The foundation still operates today and has expanded globally, offering scholarships and grants to up-and-coming talents in dance, theater, and film. Every year it holds a gala in her name that raises money for creative education. The foundation also funds health initiatives and child welfare programs across Europe and the U.S. It partners with hospitals, funds outreach clinics, and helps children from underprivileged backgrounds access care. What started as a small effort led by a former actress became a global organization with real, measurable impact. Even after her death, it continued to grow under the leadership of her children, keeping her mission alive. The world never let go of Grace Kelly. She became a permanent reference point, someone you can't sum up with just a crown or a film reel. Whether you look at her as an artist, a royal figure, or a historical icon, her name still opens doors. It's attached to trust, style, power, and grace, in every sense of the word. So, what do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below.